Olaudah Equiano, the abolitionist and veteran of the 7 Years' War, claimed that when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. Again, this was not war in the conventional sense between distinct armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, mastery, dominance was by nature a forceful assault, to be met with simmering violence ignited by resentment against the fraud, rapine, and cruelty of the enslavers. To the enslavers, Equiano asked, "Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection?" It was not a rhetorical question. Equiano had been in Jamaica in 1772, when the island was still reeling from the uprisings of the previous decade. There he had seen how entire worlds could be organized around violence and counterattack. He held this view in common with other Black people and other oppressed people in other times and places. So, alongside freedom, capitalism, and democracy, as defining keywords and themes in American history, I think we have to add nearly continuous warfare. Some years ago, our late former president, Jimmy Carter, told a church congregation in Plains, Georgia, that the United States is, quote, the most warlike nation in the history of the world.
Vincent Brown doesn't just tell stories. He unearths the hidden connections between past atrocities and present-day struggles. He reveals how the legacy of slavery continues to shape our world, from economic systems to social hierarchies. What if the past is not just a memory, but a living force? In a time when historical truth is under attack, Brown's voice rings out with urgency. He exposes the insidious attempts to erase Black history, to silence the voices of the oppressed. What are they so afraid of us knowing? Brown shatters the myth of passive victimhood, revealing the fierce resistance of enslaved Africans. He illuminates the military strategies and organized rebellions that challenge the very foundations of colonial power. Did you know that enslaved people were strategic warriors? The wealth of Jamaica, built on the backs of enslaved labor, becomes a chilling case study in the brutality of colonialism. Brown uses this historical example to illustrate the economic and political forces that shaped the slave trade. What does the wealth of a nation, built on human suffering, tell us? Brown highlights the enduring power of education as a tool for liberation. He showcases the revival of freedom schools, a testament to the resilience of Black communities and their unwavering commitment to historical truth. Can knowledge truly set us free? This isn't just a history lesson, it's a call to action. Brown's insights demand that we confront the uncomfortable truths of the past and work towards a more just and equitable future. Are you ready to heed the warning of history? This video is a vital reminder that the past is not dead, it's shaping our present.
Not long ago, it seemed like universities were leading an effort across a range of institutions to reckon with the most iniquitous aspects of their history. Acknowledging the harmful legacies of colonialism, slavery, and racism, leaders of civil society sought out to make amends. It didn't get very far. In their efforts to account for the legacies of slavery, institutions had reacted to a sudden swerve in public consciousness. The transnational uprisings, inspired by high-profile killings of Black people in the 20-teens, drew renewed attention to persistent racial inequalities in life chances, in policing and the administration of justice, and in the very way societies represented who and what were important. Demonstrations cropped up against the symbols of the colonial and slaveholding past, crisscrossing the Atlantic Ocean, from the Black Lives Matter movement that began in the United States to the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa and the United Kingdom, which inspired people to take down statues of Confederates in the US. And in this wave of iconoclasm, Cecil Rhodes, Silent Sam, Robert E. Lee, and Edward Colston could all be surrogates for each other in a transnational story of empire, colonialism, and slavery, a story that demanded retelling with attention to its victims. But as we all know, soon after the troubles of 2020, the political mood shifted decisively. In the US, numerous states passed laws restricting the teaching of Black history and the subject of race and racism, beginning with Florida's rejection of an advanced placement course for African American studies by public schools because, officials said, it was contrary to Florida law and lacks educational value. Right-wing activists sought to ban school materials considered to be woke. School officials in several states told teachers to hide their books or to wrap their covers in plain paper to avoid detection by censors. Finding an opportunity in the domestic divisions that intensified in the wake of October 7th, 2023, a growing chorus that included powerful donors, blamed student protests on what they called an oppressor-oppressed worldview that associated Israel with the history of colonial racism. Reformers, who had offered concessions to those who sought transformative justice, now retreated before others who wanted the restoration of old orders, even if that required more policing and punishment to bring people back into line. The backlash has made rapid progress since the 2024 presidential election. Attacks against a changing series of demonized acronyms, BLM, CRT, DEI, are condensed in an executive order issued January 29th that seeks to end what it calls racial indoctrination and discriminatory equity ideology, and to penalize K-12 schools that stray from patriotic education. Asked by Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy if African American history classes would violate the executive orders, the incoming Secretary of Education has said that she is not quite certain. At a time when the executive branch of the national government is violating the rule of law and the Constitution in order to dismantle the civil service in advance of the likely looting of the Treasury, the crisis in education policy may not be the most urgent thing happening to the country and the world. But telling the truth about our history becomes even more important at a time when distortion is a strategy of power. And I've decided just keep doing my job until they force me to stop. So it's all right with you this afternoon. I want to explore the value of Black study and Black history, not just as a record of our past, but as a guide for navigating the present and shaping the future. And I want to do so by telling a story about Black revolt. The backlash I've described is not only a denial of Black history, this is, more importantly, in my view, a refusal to acknowledge Black perspectives on history more generally. It is a denial of our right to critically analyze all of our history from points of view that may be more common to Black people than others. Perspectives that emerge from a history of enslavement, impoverishment, and racial violence, and that question the customary disavowal that these things constitute fundamental features of the American experience. As the historian of education, Jarvis Givens, has said, to deny students the opportunity to critically study Black life and culture is to deny them the opportunity to think outside of the racial myths that are deeply embedded in the American curriculum. Now, we can be outraged by these attempts at censorship, but no one should be surprised. The effort to suppress, distort, and defame Black history has a very long history of its own. And although many of us are accustomed to thinking of the issue of racism in national terms, this is a resolutely transnational issue. Advocates of the backlash say that their schemes will ensure that education is grounded in the history and philosophy of Western civilization. So I think we should consider the implications of that goal. In the first half of the 19th century, the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, one of the founders of modern Western philosophy, proclaimed that Africa forms no historical part of the world. His idea was that you didn't find the same kind of movement, energy, or historical dynamism in Africa that one could see in Europe and Asia. In his view, and that of many other proponents of civilizational thinking, nothing ever changed in Africa, and by extension, Black people were not agents of transformation. Throughout the 19th century, coinciding with the rise of scientific racism, there was a prevailing assumption among officially sanctioned educators that Black people, both in and outside of Africa, were primitives, who did not transform, who did not change, and were not modern people. When history and other academic disciplines were established in the 19th century, what professional scholars counted as history were mostly the actions of people who did European statecraft or politics in America. It was not really until decolonization in the mid-20th century that the historical profession at large began to treat Africa and Black people seriously as historical subjects. Precocious intellectuals like Carter G. Woodson, who established what was then called Negro History Week in February 1926 in the US, which became Black History Month in 1970, were trying to assert the importance of that history to a mainstream educational establishment and a general public that had been denying its educational value since the advent of modern scholarship. Teachers of Black history and culture, then, inherited a historiography from generations of professionals who didn't really think there was a subject there, or at least not a subject as rich, dynamic, important, and consequential as anybody else's history. Black History Month is still charged with changing those basic assumptions about whose history matters. And here, too, the stakes have always been high. In 1933, as European fascists pursued their claim to lead Western civilization, and students burned 25,000 volumes of so-called un-German books in Berlin, Carter G. Woodson published The Miseducation of the Negro. He could not have stated the implications of that miseducation any more clearly, and I quote, "If you can control a person's thinking, you do not have to worry about their actions," he wrote. "When you determine what a person shall think, you do not have to concern yourself with what they will do. If you make a person feel that they are inferior, you do not have to compel them to accept an inferior status, for they will seek it themselves. If you make a person think that they are justly outcast, you do not have to order them to the back door. They will go without being told. And if there's no back door, their very nature will demand one." Unlike so many who seem to believe that students need only bare recitation of facts, shorn of interpretation and theoretical reflection, Woodson knew that the mere imparting of information is not education. That insight should remind us that African American studies is not merely synonymous with African American history, just as the history of race and racism is not perfectly coterminous with the history of Black people. African American or Black studies, as the historian Robin D.G. Kelly has explained, tries to understand how Black people came into being in the modern world, how that process, through kidnapping, enslavement, the extraction of labor, the extraction of ideas, was foundational to the modern world. And finally, the way that African people tried to remake and re-envision that world through art, through ideas, through social movements, through literature, through study in action. In contrast to this vision, much of the US public discusses African American history as if it were a subset, some small part of the larger US historical experience. And one can see it that way, from within a narrow vision of national history. In this case, still, the Black experience is crucial to understanding key themes in the Chronicle of America. There can be no adequate comprehension of freedom without considering the centuries of slavery that culminated in the US Civil War. The history of market capitalism cannot be understood in isolation from the fundamental importance of the trade in human beings and the production of racial inequality. The vital importance of democracy is best perceived from the perspective of those who suffered the domination of masters and authoritarian legal regimes, as well as exclusion from the franchise. In other words, the very things Americans care most about and have argued over most vehemently and for the longest time make no sense without Black perspectives on our history. And yet, I think it's still more illuminating to learn how this one nation state emerged from the larger world of Africa and African America as a subset of Black history's global, or at least Atlantic-wide development. Black history doesn't begin in 1776 or in 1619 for that matter. And its scope is not limited to North America south of the Canadian border. Black history is world history, and as such it has lessons and warnings for the world. After all, much of what you might think of as Western history is tightly braided with Black history. Or maybe you could say these histories meet at critical intersections. Some years ago, I was teaching a lecture course on the United States and Haitian revolutions when I learned from a student that taking the class would fulfill her non-Western history requirement. I paused. The course, called American Revolutions in the Atlantic World, considered the two great upheavals as part of a continuous sequence of radical challenges to established authority, resulting in fundamental transformations of governance throughout the region. So what was particularly non-Western about it? I didn't suspect they meant the American Revolution. So it must have been the tent of the Haitian Revolution. For though it was closely entwined with the concurrent revolution in France, and ultimately made possible the westward expansion of the United States to the Mississippi River, Black Africans made up the largest proportion of the participants. But then these were the same men and women whose actions pushed the French National Assembly to outlaw racial discrimination in 1792 and to abolish slavery in 1794, extending the rights of man and citizen to include non-whites. So surely this was a touchstone development in the history of the so-called West, right? The rights of man and citizen. We know that European empires in the Americas, the growth of colonial settlements and trading networks, and the development of global capitalism are all indispensable aspects of Western history. We know, too, that more than 3/4 of migrants to the Americas between 1500 and 1820 were from Africa. So were their experiences and perspectives not also part of the West? By asking this apparently outlandish question, I aim to bring social geographies in which history cannot readily be conflated with circumscribed territories more closely into focus. Empire, migration, and revolution, the subjects of my course, were fluid and encompassing phenomena that scrambled conventional boundaries, not least because categories such as West and non-West are themselves artifacts of such intensive trans-regional interactions. Empirically, this is obvious enough. So the fact that we still organize historical knowledge in such misplaced ways suggests the need to think more deeply about how history plays out on the maps in our minds. By default, we tend to think in terms of discrete units, continents, oceans, nation states, regions, Europe, Africa, America, East, West, or Middle East. Our research and teaching continue to be organized that way, but history doesn't generally unfold like that. Let me illustrate the point more concretely by discussing an example even closer to home. Few Americans are aware, still, that Great Britain's most important American colony was on the verge of insurrection in 1776. Colonists perceived that the government in Britain was conspiring against the rights of imperial subjects. They feared a plot against the English liberties they had long enjoyed. At their dinner tables, they heatedly discussed the merits of open sedition. Those disaffected with imperial governance dwelled upon the topic of American rebellion. But as these Jamaican colonists debated liberty, their slaves saw an opportunity. The island was at a critical juncture with the British entry into yet another imperial war. Colonists traded exaggerated accounts of a French and Spanish military buildup in the Caribbean and calculated that there were 30 slaves to every white person ready to join the attempts of any enemy in a general massacre, they said. On July 3rd, 1776, a regiment of troops from Hanover Parish left for a rendezvous at Port Royal, scheduled to depart the island for North America by the end of the month. Throughout that parish, enslaved people gathered frequently in houses, grounds, and open fields to hold very serious conversations, which stopped suddenly upon the approach of anyone they did not trust. They were strategizing. Now or never, they thought, was the time to make themselves masters of the country, the records say. The moment seemed ripe for a successful uprising, but this American Revolution was not to be. As so often happened with slave rebellions, the plot was betrayed and the conspiracy unraveled. When the British in Jamaica considered the gravity of their predicament in 1776, rather than looking ahead to the loss of the 13 colonies on the North American continent, they actually looked to the past, back to a slave insurrection in 1760, which had been the most dangerous threat to the British Empire to date. And they reflected on the differences between the unrest of 1760 and 1776, mostly in terms of the nature of warfare with their own slaves. The transatlantic slave trade spread people from Atlantic Africa throughout the Americas. Some, who had been leaders or soldiers, suddenly found themselves uprooted from sustaining landscapes, scattered by currents and trade winds, and replanted in unfamiliar territories where they labored in captivity to rebuild their social lives. Inevitably, some of them determined that only war could end their bondage. This process of dispersal from a native land, transplantation, and adaptation to a new and strange one is familiar to students of cultural change, who have examined transformations in African religion, expression, and identity by viewing African, American, and Atlantic history in a common framework. A similar approach shows how the turmoil of enslavement and the daily hostilities of life in plantation society generated a militant response that traveled took root and sprouted in rebellions that reverberated across the Americas and back to Europe. That is what happened when groups of Africans called Coromantes from the Gold Coast, the West African region stretching from the Comoe and Volta River to between the Comoe and Volta rivers, roughly what's now Ghana, who had an established reputation for military prowess, broke out in a series of revolts and conspiracies in the 17th and 18th centuries, most dramatically in Cartagena, Suriname, St. John, New York, Antigua, and Jamaica, an archipelago of insurrection stretching throughout the North Atlantic Americas. The Jamaican insurrections of 1760 to 61, followed by further uprisings in 1765 and 66, were among the largest and most consequential of these. From what observers could glean of the aims and tactics of these rebels, it was clear that many had been soldiers in Africa, and perhaps whole cadres of people arrived in the Americas with military training and discipline, or at least some knowledge of defensive and evasive tactics that they had learned in Africa. Indeed, as some scholars suggest, American slave revolts might be seen in key respects as extensions of African wars. Even as the slave trade wrought displacement, alienation, death, and suffering on an unimaginable scale, the massive dispersal of Africans across the Atlantic also scattered the seeds of military conflict throughout the Americas. The story of the Coromantes shows how African warfare was reconstituted, not as a direct continuation of previous struggles, but as an outgrowth of immigrant experiences. British slaveholders valued Coromantes highly. Planters stereotyped them as being best suited for agricultural labor, and they had reputations for military bearing and discipline. So they were often employed in command and supervisory roles in plantation work gangs, and sometimes played roles in the armed forces, including the Royal Navy. But the British also noted, as I said, that Coromantes were particularly rebellious and prone to uprisings. Now, they were dangerous to enslavers in part for the same reason that slave traders found the Gold Coast to be an abundant source of potential laborers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the region witnessed the transformation of major empires, Dinshida, Akwamu, Akim, and Ashanti, among dozens of smaller polities which vied with each other in the region. Boosted by an escalating firearms trade, the battles that attended these contests produced great quantities of war captives for sale to the human traffickers on the coast. They also produced a turbulent environment in which complex military campaigns involved both European and African rivalries, multiple alliances, negotiations, and treachery. Among the Coromantes, different ideas of how to live in slave society once they got there, how to evade its worst abuses, and how to destroy it altogether shaped their rebellions even as they recalled their prior experiences in Africa. In the turbulent world of Atlantic warfare, nothing was more important than learning where and how to form loyal units, alliances, and coalitions in the face of superior power. The enslaved had won this wisdom through hard experience on the Gold Coast before coming to America, where they learned it anew and with different particulars in order to make war on the enslavers. In April 1760, an enslaved West African chief called Taki and other leaders and followers staged a massive uprising against brutal conditions on the island of Jamaica, then, as I said, the most important of Great Britain's American colonies. Over the next 18 months, as their numbers grew into the thousands, the rebels thwarted an initial crackdown, conducted a skillful guerrilla campaign against the might of the British Empire. Shaken by the scale of the revolts, Britain's colonial forces eventually responded with overwhelming force, killing and brutally executing at least 500 black men, women, and children. Hundreds more were transported from the island for life. But the brutal British response could not contain the revolt's consequences, which included an amplification of anti-black racism, the emergence of a movement to abolish the slave trade, and perhaps most surprisingly, and what I'll talk about in a moment, a reorganization of the British Empire that provoked another rebellion on the North American continent. 1776 customarily marks a key moment in the origin of the United States of America. Of course, when the Declaration of Independence announced the separation of the 13 colonies from the mother country. When referring to the origins of this nation, though, the date obscures the broader context of the times. It deflects attention from the fact that Britain held more than 24 colonies in America, not just the 13 that broke away. and that by far the most profitable, militarily significant, and politically connected of those colonies were those in the Caribbean. In the British Caribbean, where some 90% of the population was made up of enslaved black people, free white people were stupendously rich, boasting more than 17 times the wealth of those in the 13 colonies. Indeed, the average private wealth of a free white colonist in Jamaica, the single most lucrative British American colony, was nearly 58 times greater than that of a similar settler in New England. Military deployments were distributed to protect that wealth, and Jamaica's planters and merchants wielded greater influence in the imperial metropolis than their North American peers. This goes some way to explaining why the poor governor of Massachusetts couldn't get as much support as he needed from British policymakers when rebels rose up in that marginal colony in the 1770s. Before that uprising, the British were well aware that the event we now know as Tacky's Revolt represented the peak of imperial crisis, and slave revolt was generally a source of their overwhelming concern. Tacky's Revolt anticipated the American Revolution by a decade and a half and the Haitian Revolution by 3 decades. It can be considered one of the first great events of what historians call the Age of Revolution. And yet, it's hardly known in the United States, despite the fact that it influenced the origin of our national independence. In the aftermath of Tacky's Revolt, to recoup some of the public costs, Jamaica's House of Assembly passed new poll taxes and commercial duties. The colonial government also committed to a tax on vellum, parchment, and paper ascertained by stamps, something that imperial reformers would attempt a few years later for all of America. The Jamaica Stamp Act of 1760 was meant explicitly to address the costs of the revolt, and as a model for the more contentious 1765 Stamp Act that you've all heard of, that would rile the colonists in North America, the 1760 tax was an early local instance of a far larger reform effort stimulated by the 7 Years' War. Near the end of that war, a world war with France and Spain and other of Britain's imperial enemies, as imperial policymakers celebrated military victories in North America, Africa, and the Caribbean, they contemplated the threat to their most vital colony, which raised the urgent question of how an expanded empire might contain its internal antagonists. In this liminal moment for imperial management, a new policy would take shape. British statesmen had worried for some time over the governance of America since the conclusion of the previous war with France and Spain in 1748. The colony's demographic, economic, and strategic value had increased dramatically in the first half of the 18th century, and the complexity of administering them had grown in tandem. British members of Parliament were spurred into a reform effort, partly by the behavior of North American colonists during the 7 Years' War, because, in the midst of the conflict, colonial assemblies flouted the authority of local governors. Elected officials allowed flagrant violations of the Navigation Acts against trading with the enemy, and colonists often failed to supply enough local troops and resources to the larger war effort. As the historian Jack P. Green has explained, this coincided with a dramatic shift from an essentially permissive to a fundamentally restrictive philosophy of colonial administration in London, amplifying the widespread conviction that the colonies had too many privileges and that those privileges ought to be reduced. News of the slave war in Britain's most profitable colony strengthened the policymakers' resolve. And in this, they were helped by a shift in attitude among Jamaica's colonists. Those colonists had previously been as restive and independent as their North American counterparts, but the slave insurrection reminded slaveholders of the benefits of empire, and they soon conveyed their gratitude, along with a request for more troops, to the new King George III and the Lords of Trade. The Colonial Assembly thanked the king. If not for His Majesty's forces, they wrote, the lives and properties of your loyal subjects would, in all likelihood, have become a prey to the slaves. Like North American colonists, slaveholders in Jamaica resented the influence of metropolitan intervention, as well as the imposition of new taxes. However, unlike so many in North America, their recent experience with slave revolt encouraged them to remain duly subject to imperial command, even passing that Stamp Act to help finance their own security. They did not like many imperial reforms, but they acquiesced to them. After the 7 Years' War, with Jamaica having served as a model for the assertion of imperial control, policymakers preferred a raft of new legislation for their North American colonies. Yet, unlike colonial Jamaica's submission, these policies inspired the well-known conflict that would ultimately split the British Empire in 1776. To put all of this another way, if you haven't learned about Tacky's Revolt, you are missing a crucial piece of the story of the American Revolution and the Africans who made it possible. And you are missing a vital lesson from Black history, that it has continued to be taught and learned, even or especially when it's not part of the official story. For it turns out that in Jamaica, African rebellion stimulated a continuing education in political history, which ensured that the subjugation of the enslaved could never be taken for granted. The slaveholding planter Simon Taylor learned this nearly half a century after Tacky's Revolt. He said, "I believe we are on the eve of a rebellion breaking out," something he wrote in 1807, barely a quarter century before Hegel would declare that Africa lay outside of world history. Several newly captured African migrants on Taylor's plantation had attempted to stab their driver. When Taylor interrogated them, he made a startling discovery. There had been what he called some improper communication between his own slaves and those on frontier estate where revolts had begun in the 1760s. Taylor, whose own overseer had been killed in 1765, recalled that the workers on frontier had, quote, always been the foremost in all insurrections in the year 1760, 65, and 67. What was most alarming, though, was that the enslaved were teaching the story of the 1760s to new arrivals. And I'm quoting Taylor now. "All the new people know of the insurrection of 40 years ago," he marveled. "If something were not going on, for what reason would they tell these new Negroes, as he called them, who have not been here 4 months on the island, what happened before any of the Negroes sent here were born?" Why, Taylor wondered, were these newcomers learning Africans' history in Jamaica? Not being in control of their thinking, he had to worry about their actions. It seems that he caught a glimpse of an oppositional political history taught and learned on the plantations, call it a radical pedagogy of the enslaved, that shaped Black people's goals, strategies, and tactics as they rehearsed bygone battles and considered future possibilities. This was indeed what your former colleague, the political theorist Cedric Robinson, called the Black radical tradition, consisting of an accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle. This episode should remind us that the telling of Black history cannot be ended by executive order, because it did not begin with official recognition in the first place. Many in the United States have begun to revive the tradition of freedom schools, of fugitive education, including churches that have decided to offer their own history curricula. But perhaps all of our schools of thought are freedom schools, and if they're not our schools. And if we learn their lessons, we won't ever be paralyzed when those who want to keep us in our place, leave us vulnerable to exploitation and untimely demise, seek to prevent Black people from being a historical part of the world. There's another lesson I want to draw from history this afternoon, a final lesson. Though this one is less an inspiration than a warning. In my recent book on Tacky's Revolt, I attempt to map a history of consequential regional connections framed by the warfare that convulsed the world of Atlantic slavery. The resulting picture looks to me like an illustration of the biblical prophecy in Isaiah 19:2, a curse and a caution. "I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight everyone against his brother and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom." Warfare migrates. This has never been more important than in the era when the violence of imperial expansion and enslavement transformed Europe, Africa, and the Americas as they interacted across the Atlantic Ocean. European imperial conflicts extended the dominion of capitalist agriculture. African battles fed captives to the transatlantic trade in slaves. Masters and their human property struggled with one another continuously. These clashes amounted to what I called a borderless slave war. war to enslave, war to expand slavery, and war against slaves, precipitating wars waged by the enslaved against slave holders. In this sense, Taki's revolt was but a war within other wars, which had diverging and overlapping provocations, combat zones, political alliances, and enemy combatants. In effect, it combined four conflicts at once. It was an extension of African wars on the continent. It was a race war between black slaves and white enslavers. It was a struggle among black people over the terms of their communal belonging, for effective control of local territory, and the establishment of their own political legacies. And it was, most immediately, one of the hardest fought battles of the 7 Years' War, that titanic global conflict between Great Britain and its European rivals. Each of these struggles emerged from different currents that converged and eddied in the Jamaican insurrections of the 1760s. Now, the slave wars that shaped the era don't fit neatly into the predominant narrative of the rise and progress of liberal freedom, even though such small, dirty wars epitomize the relationship between labor, commerce, and global power. That they seem out of place in our prevailing narratives is also due, I think, to the reluctance to acknowledge slave revolt itself as an act of war. By custom, we treat war as an interruption in the normal course of affairs. War is an anomaly in the regular order, a disturbance, a break, an aberration. We commonly assume that lines of battle between contending states constitute the most important theaters of military engagement, and that peace treaties can mark a war's definitive end before another one begins with new causes and different fronts. By contrast, when war becomes a way of life, as in the abundant violence of slave war, there's no border and no final result. The state of war that enabled Atlantic empires to flourish, the violence of state-making, territorial acquisition, and strategic competition flowed into the quotidian brutality that typified the social relations of slavery, where the projection of will and the exercise of power were at their most naked and absolute. That violence has an afterlife. If you accept the sociologist Orlando Patterson's classic definition of slavery as the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons, slavery itself can be seen as a state of low-intensity warfare. And you don't have to take Patterson's word for it. That is how many enslaved people described their predicament at the time. Most famously, Olaudah Equiano, the abolitionist and veteran of the 7 Years' War, claimed that when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. Again, this was not war in the conventional sense between distinct armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, mastery, dominance was by nature a forceful assault, to be met with simmering violence ignited by resentment against the fraud, rapine, and cruelty of the enslavers. To the enslavers, Equiano asked, "Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection?" It was not a rhetorical question. Equiano had been in Jamaica in 1772, when the island was still reeling from the uprisings of the previous decade. There he had seen how entire worlds could be organized around violence and counterattack. He held this view in common with other black people and other oppressed people in other times and places. So, alongside freedom, capitalism, and democracy, as defining keywords and themes in American history, I think we have to add nearly continuous warfare. Some years ago, our late former president, Jimmy Carter, told a church congregation in Plains, Georgia, that the United States is, quote, the most warlike nation in the history of the world. This country, he said at the time, has enjoyed only 16 years of peace in the almost 250 years of its existence. Looking honestly at what has happened over the last many years, not just the past few weeks, the failures of political leadership, the shambolic public health system, the denial of reality, and the outright sabotage of our system of government, U.S. society does appear to be hopelessly dysfunctional. Many commentators identify the source of our troubles as the unwillingness or inability to identify and defend the truth. But as the old saying goes, truth is the first casualty in war. A sure sign of belligerence is the will to blind yourself to nuance, complexity, and change, and instead see only the binary opposition between friend and foe. If we are a warlike people, we are increasingly shooting ourselves in the foot and training our weapons on each other. We can look to the past to understand the ongoing processes that have shaped our world. Our current predicament, marked by extreme inequalities, everyday violence, militarism, and political strife, derives in part, I would argue, from the history of colonial conquest, slavery, and imperial warfare. Yet our struggles for freedom and dignity emerge from that history too. By understanding it, we might discern the scope, force, direction, and likelihood of the changes ahead, and be guided by the example and the wisdom of our ancestors. Through study and action, we can learn from the historic struggles of the enslaved and their descendants, just as they learned from each other to sustain communities in the face of domination. We will know that those communities transcend the borders of nation states and that they share a common enemy in poverty, war, and racial injustice around the world. And we will always be clear about the danger of remaining ignorant of how Black people came into being and how they have tried to remake and re-envision that world. Black perspectives on history echo the warning voiced by Haile Selassie and Bob Marley, and also Sinead O'Connor, that until the basic human rights are equally guaranteed to all without regard to race, this is a war. But our freedom schools will offer hope that we will win, confident in the ultimate victory of good over evil. Thank you.
Vincent Brown's discourse at the UCSB Interdisciplinary Humanities Center serves as a critical intervention in our understanding of history, particularly Black history, and its enduring relevance to contemporary global struggles. His expertise, bridging academic scholarship with media production, positions him uniquely to illuminate the complexities of the past and their impact on the present for Black communities worldwide. His work is not merely an academic exercise, but a vital tool for understanding their collective experience and navigating ongoing struggles for justice. The recognition of Black History Month as a moment to highlight ongoing struggles for justice and recognition underscores the continuous nature of the fight against systemic oppression. Brown's emphasis on situating Black history within a broader global narrative of migration and social movements challenges the compartmentalization of historical events and highlights the interconnectedness of human experiences. In California, a pivotal battleground for reparations and land claims, this perspective is particularly salient, demanding a re-evaluation of historical injustices and a commitment to restorative justice. The importance of Black history as a critical perspective in education, amidst rising censorship, cannot be overstated. Recent executive orders aimed at limiting discussions of racial issues represent a direct attack on the integrity of historical scholarship. For Black communities, this censorship is a form of erasure, denying them the right to their own history and undermining their struggle for recognition. Brown's work becomes a crucial counter-narrative, challenging racial myths and fostering a more comprehensive understanding of American and global history. The historical roots of racism, as exemplified by G.W.F. Hagel's dismissal of African history, continue to shape educational narratives and perpetuate harmful stereotypes. This marginalization of Black contributions is not merely a historical relic, but an ongoing process that reinforces systemic inequalities. The establishment of Black History Month, therefore, is not a symbolic gesture but a vital act of resistance against this erasure, asserting the centrality of Black experiences in global history. Brown's assertion that Black history is integral to understanding America's democracy and capitalism challenges the dominant narrative that separates economic development from racial exploitation. The history of slavery and racial inequality is not a footnote but a foundational element of Western economic systems. Recognizing this connection is crucial for dismantling the structures that perpetuate economic inequality and racial injustice. The efforts to confront racial discrimination and expand rights in the late 18th century, as highlighted by Brown, represent a crucial moment in the struggle for equality. However, these moments of progress must be understood within the broader context of systemic oppression and ongoing resistance. The migration of Africans to the Americas and its profound impact on Western history underscores the need for a more inclusive and interconnected understanding of global events. The military background of African soldiers and their role in fueling revolts against slavery challenges the narrative of passive victimhood. The resilience and rebellion of enslaved Africans, exemplified by the Coromantese from the Gold Coast, highlight their agency and resistance against dehumanization. This perspective is crucial for understanding the complex dynamics of power and resistance in the Americas. The displacement of Africans and the resulting military conflicts and uprisings reshaped the political and social landscape of the Americas. The historical rivalries and power struggles in Africa and their impact on the slave trade further illustrate the interconnectedness of global events. Understanding these dynamics is essential for comprehending the complex origins of racial inequality and the ongoing struggle for justice. The wealth of Jamaica and the influence of slave revolts on British colonial policies highlight the economic and political significance of slavery in shaping Western history. The Takis Revolt, a precursor to the American and Haitian revolutions, underscores the fear of slave rebellions and their impact on British imperial policies. These historical events challenge the narrative of inevitable progress and highlight the role of resistance in shaping political change. The shift in British imperial policy, following military victories, reflects a growing concern about internal threats, particularly in North America. The behavior of North American colonists during the 7 Years' War and the resulting calls for reform illustrate the complex relationship between colonial power and internal dissent. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for comprehending the origins of the American Revolution and its enduring legacy. Taylor's findings, revealing a legacy of enslaved education and resistance, highlight the importance of preserving and transmitting historical knowledge. The revival of freedom schools in the U.S. reflects a continued effort to educate about Black history and empower marginalized communities. These initiatives are crucial for challenging dominant narratives and fostering a more inclusive understanding of the past. The lessons from history, as highlighted by Brown, reveal the dangers of exploitation and conflict when marginalized communities are excluded from historical narratives. The Takis Revolt, a complex web of interconnected conflicts, illustrates the role of warfare in shaping slavery and resistance. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for preventing future atrocities and building a more just and equitable world. Ola Ekwano's articulation of slavery as a state of war underscores the constant violence and conflict inherent in systems of oppression. The United States, historically described as warlike, has experienced minimal peace, reflecting broader societal dysfunction and political failures. Understanding these connections is crucial for addressing the root causes of violence and building a more peaceful and just society. The ongoing effects of colonialism, slavery, and militarism continue to shape contemporary social struggles and perpetuate extreme inequalities. Understanding these historical injustices is crucial for empowering communities to unite against poverty, war, and racial injustice. Brown's work provides a framework for understanding the past and building a more equitable future. Vincent Brown's insights demand a critical re-evaluation of historical narratives and a commitment to dismantling the structures that perpetuate inequality. Finally, the urgency of Brown's message is clear. It is a clarion call to action, demanding we use the lessons of history to dismantle the systems of oppression that continue to plague our world and to build a future grounded in justice and equality.